I was a sound editor for 17 years, and the last film that I did as sound editor was The Duelists. So that's where I met Ridley, and we got on extremely well, I thought. And I got a call from his office to find out if I would be free to do the sound on a new film he was going to do called Alien. So I phoned back and said, thank you very much, but I'll cut it, but I'm not going to do the sound. So he phoned up and he said, well, you better come and meet the producers of this film. So I did, and I met David Giler and Gordon Carroll. And after spending half an hour with them and Ridley and stuff, I said, well, can I do the film or not? They said, of course. Which I tell you was one of the great thrills of my life, because it was going to be a fantastic film. You knew reading the script it was going to be interesting. And to work with Ridley, who I admire from The Duelists. I didn't know him apart from that. I knew he did commercials and did the fantastic commercials. But Duelists was wonderful. And I thought, well, if what he made that look like, what's he going to make a science fiction movie look like?
Editing was in a trailer in EMI, and then finally at Bray. The editing process on this, plus mix, music and mix, because there's Jerry Goldsmith's score, I think probably was maybe in 20 weeks. Now I can post in 12 to 16 weeks, but I think it's partly, the Avid is faster. Don't forget, in those days you're using Hollywood Moviola and Chem, right? Or Steenbeck. I used to like that. I used to like hands-on, and Terry Rawlins would go and have the films brought from the shelf, and you'd run it on the Hollywood movie, or choose a moment, then cut it in, put it on the Steenbeck, then check it, and then do it again. Now it's like press button, bang, bang.
When I read it, I thought myself, this is going to be one of the scariest things if we can get it right, And I think the way we did get it right is by keeping it slow, funny enough, which is completely different than what they do today. And I think the slowness of it made the moments that you wanted people to be sort of scared, then we could go as fast as we like, because you sucked people into a corner and then attacked them, so to speak. And I think that's how it worked. I mean, I like to go on the set as much as I can. In the moments I could get away from the cutting room, because I like to be there to hear what he's talking to the actors about, and then I can talk to him myself about what does he want out of this scene, and he would tell me what his plan is and why he's shooting it a certain way. I just couldn't get over the look of it. The sets were fantastic, the lighting was great, and performances. And it was just like, I think I said once before, working with him, I did Legend and Blade Runner with him. And it was like, when you get his rushes, it's like walking through an art gallery. Everything is great. You want to dwell on everything. So it's deciding, what are you going to use out of all this material? Because it looks fantastic. You know what you've got to achieve from it. But how you achieve it, after all these years, is very difficult to sort of pin down. I did that because of this or because of that. The face hugger, when it flies out of the egg, well, I have various angles on the stuff coming out, including it. And what you try to do is to get, like trying to get it to unwind, come out like it's unwinding. So you'd use a few frames of this and a couple of frames of that and a few frames of that, so that you had this thing whirl. When you look at the first cut of a film like Alien, you've really got to use your imagination, because there's no sound, for one thing. Lots of those scenes were shot with all these noisy machines or effects working on the stages. So you used to run all these things silent. You sit there and look at him creeping around in the rain room silent, and it's boring. So you've got to imagine what it's going to be like with all these jingling chains and the rain. So it's like all those things, creeping around corridors with nothing happening. But when you got the music effects and everything. So that was one of the things you had to sort of combat.
Okay, put that on the screen for me. Can you get closer?
It was 3 hours and 12 minutes, the first cut of it. And I knew it was going to be great, but I said, oh no, I just hope that people don't get carried away with pretensions, because I remember Ridley's words, I want this to be unpretentious. So I had no input other than to beg them to say, please cut an hour out, no matter what you think. It has to be close to a 2-hour movie that you think you're losing, because everything's there. You don't have to cut out any big moments. It shouldn't move this slowly. And they said, don't worry, we know we can't. Nobody wants to lose an extra screening, and we'll get it down. And the next time I saw it, it was the perfect length. It was a 2-hour movie.
Length was an issue, and we had obviously shot the sequence where Dallas is found in the ship as an egg, still alive, and she tortures him. And I know that I seem to remember we had to take about 11 minutes out the movie. And funny, something that, in fairness, that scene never ever really worked quite as well as it should be, because it just didn't really look realistic enough, him and the egg.
I didn't think they were going to be able to use it because of the... When I read it in the script, it was sort of... It slowed the pace of the exit, of the end of the picture. The picture had to have that pace. Her trying to get the hell out of there, and we're all rooting for her to get out of there, and for her to slow up and have a conversation with Dallas was not appropriate.
The last 17 and a half minutes of the film is Sigourney with no dialogue. And we are ripping around those corridors.
I remember when I first saw Alien, I was sitting in a projection room all by myself, and of course everything was much over length. I remember to this day the one scene where he was looking for his cat, and it was in this dark chamber in the ship, and I remember this chain hanging down, water dripping, and they hadn't cut it, and it went on, and I was absolutely terrified. Yeah, I kept saying, it's just a movie, and it really scared the shit out of me, to be really honest. I mean, I was terribly frightened with it. And, which is good, because that helps when I have to sit down and write the music for it. In other words, I like to go see a film, any film that I'm doing, I try to see it first as an audience and react as the audience, and try to distance myself from what I eventually have to do.
Jerry Goldsmith's score is one of my favorite scores. Seriously threatening, but beautiful. And, I mean, it has beauty, darkness, and seems to play the DNA of some distant society, which you'd have to call it. You know, that space jockey would be from somewhere, and they would have some kind of order, social order or disorder.
I always think of space as being the great unknown, and not as terrifying, but questioning, and it's sort of an air of romance about it. And that's why I like doing Star Trek, because it's very romantic, and it paints space that way instead of all the weird things and all that. And I guess I approached Alien that way. There was this air of mystery, but there was sort of a beauty to it and the unknown. And I thought, well, let me play the whole opening very romantically and very lyrically, and then let the shock come as the story evolves. Not, in other words, don't give it away in the main title. So I wrote this very nice main title. There's sort of mystery, but it was lyrical mystery. It didn't go over too well, and really I had major disagreements over that. So then I subsequently wrote a new main title, which was the obvious thing, weird and strange, and which everybody loved, and I didn't love, and it was very interesting. Consequently, I kept getting kudos for years after on the main title I wrote for Alien, which was not exactly my choice, and the original one I wrote took me like a day to write it, and the alternate one took about 5 minutes to write.
Let me just say to start with, I think the man is a genius. I think he's done the greatest scores, who I admire. But I also feel he's very stubborn, like I am myself, I think. And when it came to Alien, I temped the film myself with as much Jerry Goldsmith music as I could, because I knew he was going to do the film.
He's an absolute master of like doing a a rough temporary soundtrack, etc. He's just got this great eye and ear, and he says, I know what piece of music would be great in there. And so he always put the most, which is a real problem sometimes because you have this free range of you can choose any music you want.
And whenever I do these temps myself, I obviously know by that time who's going to be the composer, and I bend over backwards to find stuff that they've done in various other films to see if I can make it work. Obviously you can't always make it work, so you have to use material from other sources. But I just think it's invaluable. And I must say at times there's areas you can get to work better than they do later, and that's not degrading anything composers do. But I don't think anybody is closer to the film than the director and the editor will ever be. I mean, we live with this, it's ours, and the thing is, when you're trying to create a temp score, and if you're interested in music, which I love, it's a love of mine, then you know the mood you want to create, you know what you want to try and say musically, and I don't think you should try and influence the composers too much, but if you get a mood correct, that's the mood I feel they should go with. They can change the theme, change the orchestration, but keep in mind the mood that we created.
I remember when the pods opened, from the hypersleep, they did eventually temp track it, and in that particular scene they had temp tracked it with a piece of music I had written for Freud. And everyone thought that, oh, look how wonderful that music works. I said, it stinks, it's all wrong. I mean, it was sort of a little lullaby that I had written for Freud. So I wrote a piece. I wrote a piece for that, and it was very impressionistic and very mysterious, but pretty, but mysterious, and I thought it worked brilliantly.
That thing's gonna eat through the goddamn hall. Come on, what's going on?
The film came out with the Freud music in it. Consequently, I got more letters saying, "Starting to repeat yourself, eh?" They had bought the music from Freud and put it in that spot. So you could see that I was sort of like going at opposite ends of the pole with the filmmakers on the picture.
And I don't think he ever forgave me for using like Howard Hanson for the end of the film and keeping the music that he wrote for Freud for the film. Though that was Fox's decision, they could have said we're using the music that's written, but I do think that what we did on our temp in those areas was better than what he did. And I'm taking nothing away from the rest of the film because what he did was perfect for it.
Well, this is always a tricky part because, finally, no matter how much of it the composer hums for you or plays on the piano or does anything like that, you don't really hear his score until you're on this, recording stage. Or at least that was the way it used to be. And his score, when it finally was way too lush and way too, more like his patent score, and which was not really what anybody particularly wanted. We wanted it more haunting and weird and strange, and it wasn't really any of that. So, actually, what happened was we bought a couple of the Goldsmith pieces that we had in the temp, and then in the dub, in the mix, we really played down a lot of his stuff and played up some kind of weird sounds that we had and all the rest of that stuff. This is really Ridley. When I say us here, I really mean Ridley. And, and he did an amazing job in the dub. But Mr. Goldsmith was quite unhappy when he saw the movie. And in fact, went to the studio. He'd done a lot of movies for Fox and, announced that we were going to be a disaster and it was horrible and we'd ruined his score and we'd done all the rest of that stuff.
They released it as an album, and I bought the album. And there were a couple of tracks on the album that weren't in the movie. And they were tracks in which Goldsmith used horns to personify the alien. And it was very effective, this creepy, distant honking that comes in that is clearly meant to be the alien's theme. And it's very effective. It's not in the movie. But then I can't really see any place in the movie that you could use it without it being intrusive.
Ridley is a brilliant filmmaker. He's a brilliant visualist, and I think that was just his second film, and he wasn't as articulate then about what the music should do. I think he thinks so much in visuals, and music cannot replicate the visuals. It's not what it's supposed to do. And I think he was thinking more in terms, at least the message I was getting for him is he wanted me to be visual with the music. Well, I can't be visual with the music. That's not what I'm supposed to do. Let the director and the cinematographer put the visuals on the screen. Let me do the emotional element. And I think that's where it became a big problem with me. And fortunately, I had a lot of time to do it, and I went back and redid music, and somehow it all worked out finally in the end. But there was a problem. And I think the biggest problem was just in communication between me and the director. It would be interesting if that film had been made today, and Ridley had now the benefit of having made so many other pictures and worked with a lot of different composers, how he would have approached it, with me musically. The real challenge of composing music for films is to write a score that works brilliantly in the film and also has a life of its own that stands by itself. I think many of the great scores of the past work brilliantly in a film, but taken by themselves, they don't stand alone.
I had a call from Peter Beale, who was then head of Fox in the UK and Europe, I think, and he said he'd like me to meet Walter Hill. And I met Walter Hill, David Guyler, Gordon Carroll up at Fox in London, in Soho. And they said, would I like to do Alien? And I'd had a script. I thought the script was outstanding, because as you read it, you knew it was going to be a good movie, or I thought it was going to be a good movie. And but I'd already signed to do Empire Strikes Back, and so I said, well, I'd love to do it, but it seems to clash with Empire. And Peter Beale said, well, it's another Fox production, I'll organise that. So he talked to Lucas and Gary Kurtz, I think, and I got the okay.
The original concepts of Alien were basically a series of storyboards, very detailed storyboards. Ridley Scott is well known for storyboarding every single scene. We had the special effects storyboards. We also had a whole bunch of paintings done by Ron Cobb, who was the conceptual artist they used for many of the spacecraft. The strange thing was that we never actually followed them, because we kept on getting messages which would come from Shepperton, where the main unit was shooting, to Bray Studios, where we were filming the models, about 30 miles away. The drawings and plans that came over seemed to be sort of a conglomeration, as if somebody had taken Ron Cobb's design and they'd altered it. And we obviously found out afterwards that Ridley Scott was having a sort of a say in this and changing things. And actually Nostromo, the main craft in the film, it kind of evolved, and it evolved many times over a period of months and months, over a year, in fact, it evolved. It originally started out as this basic space tug. We shot on this thing with it actually painted yellow for 6 months, and this was the time when Brian Johnson was involved in the film. However, Brian went off to work on Empire Strikes Back, and we painted the spacecraft grey on Ridley Scott's orders, and then when Ridley Scott finished shooting main unit stuff at Shepperton, came over to Bray Studios, and we basically started from scratch.
Well, the plan was, the great plan, which of course Ridley had no intention of ever adhering to, was that the effects would be shot parallel with the main unit shooting. And Brian Johnson had that rather difficult task of actually doing that. And he shot some very nice stuff, but I know that Ridley knew that he could, in the same way that to jump to another movie, Blade Runner, he already wanted to look through the camera and line those shots up himself, which he did in the end, and it resulted in those incredible sort of city shots. Ridley was determined that he wanted to do them himself. So I think he kind of, consciously or unconsciously, he kind of said, no, that's not quite right, that's a little bit too... I think in fairness, I think the shots were a little bit too colourful sometimes. And Ridley I know you could grade them down, but Rid sort of had these specific ideas, really.
I was asked to organise a cameraman to work with the visual effects group. That I did, somebody I'd known several years before. I think Ridley kind of had words with the DP. I certainly had worked with the DP, Denny Ailing. On the second Saturday of principal photography, Ridley told me he was going over to Bushy on that Saturday and asked that I go along there with them. And we went over there and we saw what Denny was doing for lighting. And I went through a kind of lighting pattern. I felt a bit sorry for Denny because he was trying to achieve something where he couldn't achieve the stop that he wanted based on the lights that he'd got. I think he'd been terrorized by the production office about how much money he'd got to spend on lights, and he really didn't have enough. The risk of getting my own backside kicked, I ordered in a lot of other equipment.
First of all, you get your model right. I mean, you get the model gnarly and aged the way you want, or pristine and clear. You get the shape right, and then you got to walk around it with the lights. And this cameraman on that was Denny Ailing on all the effects. And we'd walk around, and I'd literally have him just on with the lights, pulling the lights around, and then just stand there and say stop. And then he'd come in and look at it, and Denny'd say, "Okay, it's too much here. It's too much. We've got to fill." So I always hated filling because I wanted to be really harsh. But Denny would always force me into filling. So we got to do a cover shot.
Initially, Ridley sort of viewed him with total and utter suspicion, but because he was actually a really good craftsman, he actually knew his job inside out, I think actually Ridley came to be rather fond of him.
What was cutting edge, which was actually we did not use, was motion control. And we didn't use it simply because the budget didn't allow us all that time to do stop motion photography. So we developed a camera which moved very slowly on a drive mechanism, but we didn't actually repeat moves as such, because at the time the shots that were written in the actual script made it possible for us to do just regular model work with a high degree of professionalism and extremely wide angle lenses.
Some of these shots, like the planet shots, that was that very painful process whereby the camera moves one tiny frame per second or something like that. And so I remember Ridley wasn't happy, or were we, with what we were getting from it. So Ridley went in and shot it himself. And he said, "Put some smoke in there." And they said, "We can't do that. This the camera moves too slowly. The smoke is going to look, put it in, And he did it, and it worked. It looked great.
Because it wasn't on motion control pads, it was just operated. It was just physically operated. And that because of that, I mostly kept the Nostromo close. So I didn't have to have stars and universe. So that's all just live shooting with a wind machine with a lot of smoke. And of course people say there is no atmosphere in space. I said there is now, mate. To make it work, I had no other way of doing it. I wouldn't have had any sense of movement because I couldn't afford big galaxy shots of it.
Working with Ridley Scott was quite an experience. It was nice to work directly with the director, with nobody in between, having a one-to-one relationship where I would go into a room, do a little drawing and show it to him, like of the clamp arm. It was nice that he would actually listen to me. I mean, I wasn't anybody really, I suppose, and it was just great to have him actually consider your opinion as well, but then come along and sort of say, right, but I want it done this way.
When you've got somebody like Ridley who's very precise about what he wants in a general term, except he keeps changing his mind and building on things. He doesn't go from one thing to another. He just expands and expands and expands. And so, like on Nostromo, that started off as a small sort of model, and then it grew, bits, pieces everywhere. Ron Cobb had done the original design, and then Ridley added bits to it. He kept saying, "Oh, let's put a bit on here and put a bit on there," because we were trying to build a large one, a large-scale one, which was about 10 or 12 feet. And it kept growing and growing and growing, and I think it wound up being about 16, 17 feet in the end.
Well, the biggest challenge has got to be the fact that Ridley Scott wanted things changed, but he would want to shoot on a model very, very short time after he decided to make radical changes. An example of this would be that we had a very, very cathedral-like refinery, which I'd done a large amount of the work on. He was very much into the sort of spire look, this kind of church spire type Gothic look. What he then did was he decided that he wanted a much chunkier looking refinery, so he would basically attack this thing with a hammer and chisel. And if you imagine you spent, say, 6-8 weeks working on a section, and suddenly he would literally pick up a mallet and a 1-inch chisel, bang, like this, and you'd see bits flying off all over the place. And so the challenge was he'd then turn around and say, right, after lunch, I want to shoot on it, and I want that bit like this and that bit like that. And you're thinking, oh, we just spent 6 weeks doing that bit, and you want to shoot on this after lunch. So one of the biggest challenges was getting the model looking good quick enough for him to shoot on it. This is a sketch that I did at the time, which was really just a doodle of the refinery showing the spire-like design. It was just really for personal use, to get a kind of a feel of how it would look as an overall design, with the Nostromo right down here at the front, the domes underneath, and then these massive spired pieces going up. These are the pieces which Ridley Scott later knocked off with his hammer and chisel. The Nostromo model weighed, somebody said I heard somebody say a quarter of a ton, but I don't know about a quarter of a ton, but it was incredibly heavy. It needed to be lifted on a forklift truck. So the model had a huge metal framework built inside it, and the Nostromo was plugged into by a forklift truck with a couple of sort of prongs on it, which actually fitted into the side of the model. And the way they achieved the Nostromo being pulled away from the refinery was that the arm itself wasn't actually motorized at all. It ran freely, and it was about 30 feet long. It was a really massive thing, again clad with thousands and thousands, in this case, of Hornby Railway piers. All these crisscross girder pieces. Went into model shops and bought 150 of these kits. And when we told the guy what we were doing with them, I don't think they believed us. And this shot was achieved by the forklift truck being covered in black velvet, plugged into Nostromo, and just driving away from the refinery, dragging the Nostromo with it. And of course, as it pulled the Nostromo away, it dragged the arm with it. So that shot where you see it going out and coming away is just the forklift truck driving away on a nice smooth surface. Originally, the Nostromo had 3 huge arms which opened, but Ridley Scott came up with this idea in an actual conversation where it would be great if a giant hand pushed the Nostromo away. So I did a very, very quick sketch of this and showed it to him, and we needed to detail it really quickly. And we found that the legs of R2-D2 just happened to have this really nice shape, and you can actually see them quite clearly clad on this thing.
I think we had 2 or 3 different scales. We had one that was about 4 feet long, and we had another one which was 12, 14, 15 feet long. And that one was very heavy, and it was cantilevered out with a forklift truck device, so that on a beam which was covered in black velvet, and because of all the dust and stuff that was around, you couldn't see any of the mechanism, because we kept it lined up so the model was in front of it and the camera couldn't see it. And that was pretty difficult. I mean, that took a lot of effort, and lots of wind machines going, and plenty of vermiculite, which was insulation for roofs and things, being blown around everywhere. Everybody had masks and goggles and everything else on, and earplugs and the lot. And in those days we didn't have radio communications the way you have now, where everybody's got their own little set and they can all join in. I mean, there was lots of shouting and screaming going on, thumping people on the back. Stop.
Nick, could we do that if we start level?
We'd stop and they'd put the light, stick some lights on, etc., and reshoot it. And then he kind of created it in front of the camera. And although there wasn't always huge logic to it, I just think the landing of the ship had, huge drama. It was very exciting. And I think, Jerry Goldsmith's music and everything worked great at that particular point.
He couldn't be burned off anything he had a passion about, and so we all got fired with the same enthusiasm. It was a labour of love. We did as much as we could to increase the production values on each of the shots, and Ridley was the key to us doing that. He pushed and pushed and pushed us all the time.
This is the sketch that I did of the Narcissus shuttlecraft, the original back section here having been built as a set and having been done as a drawing by Ron Cobb, the conceptual artist. I then came up with this idea of what the nose would look like, and it was from this that the final model was constructed. And also just a very, very quick sketch showing the rear section. This was to enable me to work out the release clamp, which I also built, which drops the Narcissus down from the Nostromo and then releases. As it did so, the word purge came up. When I went to see Blade Runner, there's a shot where the car takes off and you see a screen, and there's the clamp arm from Alien on there, which I'd actually designed, and purge come up. And I thought, that is amazing. I wonder how many people noticed that. We had a shot which required the burial shroud where John Hurt's character Kane has died to be fired out of the Nostromo's hatch. Now, many people would think, well, there'd be sort of computerised ways of doing this, but not at all. I mentioned Nick Alder, that became the special effects director. We had a very, very large section of Nostromo built, about 40 feet long, which was supposed to be kind of the underside, like a trench on the underside of Nostromo, very reminiscent of the trench in Star Wars. I'm sure there was a crossover there. And what we actually did was I carved, and again I given a very short period of time to carve Kane's burial shroud in wood, and I made a burial shroud about 8 inches long. And Nick Alder got hold of the fisherman's catapult for firing bait out into the pond where you're fishing, and he just put a flat right down at the end of the studio, and he just pulled the catapult back and fired my little model, and it went down the trench. And of course they filmed it at high speed, so it came out in slow motion, and he just did this over and over again. And what they did was, because it would drop eventually as it flew away, eventually its trajectory, like an arrow, it would drop down, but they cut it before it did that. And I just thought that was just the most amazing piece of simple way to get around a shot. And just seeing him firing this thing on the fisherman's catapult. He then started firing it at people. That's another story. Later, he needed a shot where you saw Ripley right at the end of the film inside the shuttlecraft moving around. So we then had to make a foreshortened version of the shuttlecraft that had a TV monitor inside it. So, that had pre-recorded film of a girl, not actually Sigourney Weaver, but her stand-in, running around inside. And that was built into the model of that.
I think the only dodgy thing was always the marriage between matte painting and model and the screen. It's always tricky, very tricky. But you know, even today in CGI, still see the whole flipping matte. And I always like to go for wherever you can, build a model, then photograph it with the light that's on the shot, and then graft it onto it.
CGI has probably, in my personal opinion, as a model maker, it's decimated much of the model making. I don't think myself that CGI will ever completely replace models. I don't care what anybody says. I think you can tell. There was a great deal of fun going on. Some of the people involved in the film. We had Nick Alder, who was basically the special effects director after Brian left. He's a real prankster. I'd worked with him on Space 1999 and know what he was like. So the relationship was actually very good. I got on very well with the guys. I'd worked with them before. With the actual crew itself, it was a very happy relationship that we had, bearing in mind we were working together for, like I've said, about 14 months.
Technology advances, you can think of new ways of doing things. There were lots of things we could have probably enhanced the production value on. We could have done huge moves through the vehicles and things, which we didn't do. But in actual fact, because the script was so beautifully written and so tight, and because Ridley was really clever with the way we didn't see Alien, but we sort of saw the alien and everything else, we were just there to sort of remind people that there was a bit of space outside and they were billions of miles from anywhere. We didn't need to do any more than that. You know, the production values enhanced what was going on in terms of the drama, but it didn't have to be a visual effects extravaganza as such to save a movie. I mean, we just enhanced what was already there, as opposed to other movies, some of recently that have come out, which are visual effects tour de forces, but no story. I mean, the key to this was the amazing story.
The glory of the cinema is that it is an audience that is seeing it, and therefore it is a collective understanding, which is quite different from watching something on tape. It has a blend of the actual theatre itself, even though what you're going to see is always exactly the same. It can vary from audience to audience according to whatever collection of people you have there.
The first screening of the movie, which ran, I think, about 4 hours long, from a 78-page screenplay. And we were supposed to go out to lunch afterwards. I was with my ex-wife, and she was so traumatized, she couldn't leave the room for a day and a half. It was more violent and more frightening, actually, at the long cut that it ended up to be.
We never really previewed it till we finished the film, which was interesting. But we finished it and we had a 70mm print and we took it to Fox. And they insisted the day we arrived, we just arrived that afternoon, that they wanted to run it that night in their dubbing theatre, the Zanuck Theatre. And they invited all the science fiction sort of people who had come in dressed up as most of the creatures you'd ever seen to see the film. And it ran terribly because the sound was so bad in there. And we never could understand it because we had a great soundtrack. We've never changed it.
Then we had one in St. Louis where the sound wasn't quite right, and that was okay.
Ridley went crazy because he went down and checked the theater before the screening, and 2 of the speakers were out, and then he didn't want to screen the picture.
And by this time, they are completely convinced that we'd made a bad soundtrack in England, and the wrong thing had arrived.
But we were all quite worried after the one in St. Louis. And then in Dallas, the next night, we had the sound absolutely right in the theater.
Let's get out of here.
We've got this far, we must go on.
We arrive in this theatre, which was run by these guys. You could have eaten off their floor. The theatre was fantastic. The sound was great. It was the most incredible preview I've ever been in. I mean, people were screaming and running out of the theatre.
From what I remember, Ridley and Ivor Powell were holding down Alan Ladd Jr., who was trying to get out of the cinema.
The usher keeled over, and not with a chestburster scene, strangely enough. People were just too stunned at that particular moment that they didn't react.
This was a through-the-roof preview. This is when we knew we really had something. In fact, there was one of the ushers fainted. They're all, they were worried about violence in the theaters and all the rest of this kind of stuff. And said, "Oh my God, there's an incident here. What's happened?" And the usher had fainted when the robot's head came off.
Had the management saying, "This is terrible. All the people are being sick everywhere, and it's in a state." And we thought, "This is great."
At first, I was standing in the back of the theater. I was saying, "What's going on? People are getting a lot of walkouts, But what it was that people were sitting close to the screen or walking back to stand and watch it in the back of the theater. They didn't want to be that close to the screen, because it was scary.
Some of the most exciting, I think, moments of my life, because there's no greater buzz than being involved in a movie, and suddenly, not only was I going to the States for the first time in my life, but I was actually being flown around with Ridley in the 20th Century Fox executive jet from preview to preview.
We never had a premiere for this movie.
And I paid for my own ticket down at Egyptian Theater to go, and I stood in line to go see this movie. I mean, it was like so totally bizarre. I wanted to see it with with an audience. People were getting up and leaving the theater and going out and barfing in the lobby. I mean, I guess it was just such a shock to everyone. I mean, we knew how it was made, and it was, our friend on the little dolly being squidged underneath the chair and stuff. But boy, I tell you, when it was cut together, it really was pretty amazing.
When we opened the film, I was staying at a friend's house in the Hollywood Hills there, looking down. I could see the Egyptian theatre where I was. And they opened it, and they ran it for 48 hours non-stop. It was just running like a loop for 48 hours. There was never a moment in that 48 hours that the queue wasn't around the block.
I got up that day. I was a complete nervous wreck. I was angry. I was angry at the world. I had not been shown proper respect on this movie. I wasn't even going to go to the opening. The hell with them. I'm not going to go to the opening of this thing.
Dan somehow had a bad experience. I remember this sticks out of my mind because of Dark Star. He remembers coming and thinking, oh my God, and nobody laughed and nobody responded and nobody came. And when they did, they didn't laugh at any of the jokes. That's what he said to me, I'll never try another comedy again. So he kept on feeling this fear that it was going to fall on its face like Dark Star did.
I jumped in my car and I just drove around streets. I drove around L.A. crazily. Nowhere. I just drove. I was mad. I'll show him. I'll this. I'll that.
I guess he got drunk or something because he almost didn't want to come. He said, I can't take it.
I'm not going with that. At 7:55, I suddenly turned the wheel and ran. I drove like a rocket into Hollywood. I drove up and I parked somewhere and I got out. And I saw this huge line of people down the block and around the block. And I said, is that for Alien? And I got out and I walked the whole length of the line. I walked all this long line. They were all lined up to see Alien, my movie. And I sort of walked up, and I drifted up towards the opening, the entrance there of the Egyptian. And I got up there, and there was Ronnie Shusett and a couple of people.
He was like a man possessed. I mean, he was just like terrified.
I said, where you been? Come in here. They took me in, and we went inside. I floated in at the theater. Every seat was full, and they put me down in a seat somewhere, and I sat there. I was kind of numb. It was like a dream. The house lights went down. The 20th Century Fox logo came up, and the whole audience cheered. Yay!
And we heard these tremendous shrieks and cheers and applause. And about the third scare hit, and Dan was sitting behind me, and he started weeping.
And my eyes flooded with tears, and the tears just ran down my face. And I just sat there and watched the movie.
And I said, Dan, and he said, I can't believe it. It's real. That's real. And he was just crying through the whole. Here's everybody cheering. He's this guy behind me crying.
Limp as a rag. And I had expected there, of course, to be moments where they would scream at the shock. And I'd expected a lot of nervous muttering and tittering, all that stuff. Wasn't what happened at all. The audience sat in absolute silence, unmoving, just staring at that screen.
Like all of us, we can't be objective about our own work. Even when he went to the previews, he just wasn't sure. He thought, well, maybe it's just those audiences are they're prone to love it, and nobody else is going to like it. Maybe not the masses that aren't the science fiction lovers. But you could tell that crowd, they went wild. I mean, they were just standing and cheering at the end of the movie.
I saw it at the Egyptian. First time I saw it in its entirety. A lot of them had come up and were standing in front. They'd walked out on the movie. And I thought, cool, it can't be that bad, right? So I go in there, watch the movie, right? And I'm quite excited by what's happening. And I thought the pacing, cutting was brilliant, right? And then when When Sigourney goes back to pick up her cat, I had this wonderful African-American voice shout out, "Leave the fucking cat!" And at that stage I knew that Ridley had got a hit on his hands.
I had the space jockey in front.
I understand somebody tried to set fire to it or something, because they thought it was the work of the devil. Great.
By then, we had already had, the night before, I'd been to the Academy, and that's a tougher audience because they're filmmakers, and it takes a lot to impress them. But that went so amazingly. Sitting behind me was Jack Nicholson and Warren Beatty, and they kept screaming like two little boys at every scare. And they came up to Dan and I later and said, "Oh, it's amazing, guys." And Dan, "My God, it's Warren Beatty and Jack Nicholson," and they scared the shit out of us. So we were just beaming, and that's a tougher audience.
It was so new in its concept of horror. I think it was more of a thriller because apart from those little odd horrid moments that things happen, it was a thriller. When's it going to happen next?
My reaction was right with them. It was a wave. We were like a tidal wave building up and crashing on the shore with apprehension. I do remember a story that Ridley told me about meeting with some theater owners after the picture had been released, and this one guy came up to me and says, "I tell you, that one scene where that thing comes out of the stomach, I tell you, it really messed up our bathrooms, and I take a great deal of pride in our bathrooms, but we took care of that. Ridley says, "Well, how did you take care of that?" He said, "Oh, we just cut it out of the picture, and bathrooms were fine after that."
I've often wondered in Alien how many eyes closed at the moment that I gave birth, as I like to put it. But, and I'm sure that it's over 50% in the first time of seeing it. And I'm sure that some people took 4 times before they actually saw it.
Women of a certain age, probably childbearing and upwards age, or certainly women in their 30s and 40s for some extraordinary psychological reason, were very, very put off by the chest burster, by the birth scene. I think they found it, deeply Freudianly disturbing. And I think that stopped it actually being an even bigger hit.
The chest bursting scene certainly worked, and you'd just hear this dead silence from the audience. They couldn't believe what they were seeing, I then realized, how effective it was on an audience, and people won't have heard so much about it, they won't even see it. They're terrified to see it, and people who have seen it regret it, and others just can't get enough.
They were so terrified. I mean, even I was terrified because they'd added, it has the most amazing sound. And between the water and the steam and the smoke and our performances and the music, you're terrified the entire time. I think I watched it through my cable net sweater. It's like that. Because once you added all that, I wasn't Ripley, who doesn't get afraid.
They were terrified. They'd never seen a movie like this. It just came at them, relentless claustrophobia. And the power of this movie is any horror film, you get inside the psychology of fear, those are inherent certain amount of things that are in people, things growing inside you, and the way that robots are as humans, and you're not quite sure who is who, and the claustrophobia of a setting where you're enclosed and can't get out of.
I went to see it in Twickenham in a huge cinema, and I was terrified. I can't remember the audience reaction because I can only remember my own, and I screamed, and I was absolutely, and I knew, of course I knew the script, I knew that the creature was going to burst forth, but it made no difference. I was petrified.
People were so into it. It was the first time we'd shown space to be a real place, filthy, greasy, grimy, with real people in it. It was certainly the opposite of 2001, which is a movie I've always found it hard to sit through, frankly, because it's so sterile and still. And this was, and it was, I have to say, so much of Ridley in it, his no bullshit kind of approach.
exciting opening. It broke all the house records. It was a very good ad campaign, I thought, simple but creepy at the same time. I think the team of Fox, people of Fox at that point in time, none of which are there anymore, really got behind the picture and sold it as hard as they could and believed in it very strongly.
The graphics we brought in were two great guys. There was Steve Frankfurt, who was pretty formidable advertising man, and Richard Greenberg, who came in with, first of all, coming into poster work, and then they came up with a great log line, in space no one can hear you scream. And then the typography, wide space to the top, I thought looked great. And then they readapted that to go on the film as the opening title sequence, which was a kind of form of hieroglyphics, really, or a readout. You don't know what it is. And then it gradually spells Alien.
Alien fulfilled a genre, and thereby put a cap on it.
Alien to me is very special, and it's not just because I worked on it. I think Ridley did such an amazing job on it, and I think it's got a mythology to it.
Until they start making feature movies in IMAX or in virtual reality, I don't think it's going to be possible to do anything that's that novel in the scary sci-fi monster vein.
The thing that made Alien scary was the fact that you weren't quite sure what you were seeing, so the audience could participate.
It was quite a milestone. It was sort of like Howard Hawks' The Thing, which was the first film I can remember where they used a science fiction element as an element of horror to really frighten you, and this was the next ultimate step.
The alien is frightening in a context much larger than outer space science fiction beings. It's fearsome in the way a child's nightmare is frightening.
It's becoming more difficult to just frighten people. Frighten people on a nice level, on an entertaining level, on a roller coaster ride. I think it's really why I've never done another science fiction. Between Blade Runner and this, I thought I hit space and the urban side of the world and sci-fi. And so, in a funny kind of way, it's good because I'll only do another science fiction if I've got a really good script. So really, finally, it's about the story. It's all about the story. The trappings, the dressing is not insignificant. It's important, and it's an art form in itself, but it's not the priority.
Ridley's Alien is actually of a different genre from the other aliens, I think. How can one put it? A sort of realistic approach, as I say, a logical approach using a thriller format, which I think was terrifically successful. And I think you can follow the whole possibility of that, particularly as more and more we know about our universe and so on, the more possible it becomes all the time. So it's not going to get unfashionable. The other aliens I would put into a different genre. I would say that they were more action-adventure films.
It's one of the great franchises that we have in today's cinema, and I think it would be not very hard and not very difficult to turn it back into where it came from. I would go back to the roots of where the first one was, which is the scary monster in the dark. That is it going to jump out on you? Is it going to get you?
I would have gone before, because that's what I find interesting. I want to know who that space jockey is. You know, what are the aliens doing in the silo? Are they armaments? Are they shipping them somewhere? All that, and I think that, for me, is fascinating.
I mean, that's what we're meant to do. You can, end it and bash it on the head and bury it, but I think you can just as easily invent the end of one, the beginning of another.